Hi, my name is James Riley of the Wisconsin Historical Fencing Association.
And I'm Ed Segrillo.
And today we're going to discuss the basic principles of Johannes Liechtenauer, specifically the 5 words, vor, nach, strong, weak, and meanwhile. So before we go into what strong and weak mean in terms of swordsmanship, I want to talk a little bit about what we don't believe they mean, and we're going to give an example of why. So when people think of someone being strong on the sword or weak on the sword, we very often think of them pushing, right, or not pushing. We think that's a mistake. We think that's an incorrect view of what strong and weak mean, and we'll get to why that is later. But more importantly, what I want to explore right now is how we can conceptualize strong and weak, and without even thinking about swordsmanship, just the terms themselves, what they structurally represent. So if my opponent approaches me without swords, I can apply pressure to his frame, and there's nothing that I can do to push him over. Right? He's braced himself against my pressure, right? And if I let go of that pressure immediately, he doesn't fall forward. He's not resisting in such a way that he would lose his balance, right? He's strong on this axis. But in order to be strong on this axis, he has to create a weakness for himself. And so if I take the exact same structure and I push against it from this direction, even if he braces himself and he applies as much resistance as he possibly can, it doesn't take any pressure at all to push him over because he's weak. He's strong against this axis, he's weak against this one. Right? When we think about these concepts in terms of swordsmanship, we want to think about being strong in such a way that you can resist the pressure without applying any pressure back, just by sinking into our structure, and being weak as sort of redirecting the force of our opponent's attack around to our weakness, right? Instead of absorbing the force of the pressure, just redirecting the force of the pressure away from us. So when I attack my opponent, he can absorb the force of my attack, or if he's weak, and I begin an offensive action from here, he can deflect the attack that I'm trying to make. But he does so in a weak way. If my opponent wants to take a strong angle on my sword, as I attack, he orients his structure into my pressure, into the pressure of my offensive action. Right? From here, he's not pushing. He's just braced the same way that he was braced when we didn't have swords. So if I strike around, all he needs to do is reorient his body to brace himself against the new pressure, and in doing so, he still is not making himself vulnerable. But what he is doing is he's creating an opening as he moves from strong to one axis to strong to another axis. He creates an opening in which he's weak. Now, he's no longer weak along this axis that I'm attacking him in. However, if he stays where he is, and I attack him here, he is weak along the new axis. Here you can see that my sword is controlling the space that his sword is occupying. And so in this situation, I'm strong. If my opponent gets the overbind, he redirects the structure of his body. Right? He's now controlling the space that my sword is in, and I'm weak. In this instance, I have a strong angle on Ed's sword. But from Ed's perspective, he isn't thinking about that I have a strong angle on him. Rather, he's thinking that he has a weak angle right now. In order to regain a strong angle, he restructures his body so that it controls the space that my sword occupies. Now he's controlling the center, and from here he can offer an attack. In this case, I can either go weaker to defend against that action, or in order to defend in a strong way, I have to reorient my body to control the space that his sword is occupying. So now we have a pretty good idea of what strong is and what weak is and how we want to use them. Now we want to think about the word Indes, meanwhile, and what it means in terms of strong or weak. We know that if my opponent takes a strong angle on my sword, if I attack a new opening, all he needs to do is reorient the structure of his body to defend against that attack. But as he's doing that, there's a space of time, the time from which he's strong on one angle and weak on another, to him changing the relationship, going weak to strong, that I can use that space of time to complete a successful offensive action. For instance, when I strike against my opponent, if I strike to his new opening, his newly created opening, which is his right side, he has to go from strong to weak. He has to close that right opening. If I catch him in the space of time from which he's doing that, then I can offer a successful action. Indes, therefore, is the space of time from which my opponent is closing one opening and opening another. The moment that I want to capture is the moment that my opponent is strong on one axis but needs to become strong on another because I'm threatening that opening. And I need to attack him into the new weakness that he's creating in that defensive action. Right? So he can do that. For instance, if I find myself in a strong bind relationship with my opponent, and I threaten to the weakness that is exposed to me, I begin by doing so. He strengthens that weakness, but in that action, I can attack him into the newly created opening. Again, if I'm strong, I threaten his opening, he closes the opening, and I can attack in that defense. I can attack the newly created opening. All right? Now what you notice is that every time I'm strong, my opponent is weak. And vice versa. If I'm weak, my opponent is strong. So who is responsible for doing what technique? And the answer is, what really matters in this case is who's in the vor and who's in the Nach.